afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to the Proclamation 2020 Publisher Orientation webinar. I am Sarah Ramirez. I serve as the Review and Adoption Coordinator here in the Instructional Materials Division at TEA. We're so grateful to you for joining us. So the purpose of this webinar is to provide publishers with information about the expectations and the requirements of the proclamation that will ultimately help in their decision to submit materials for Proclamation 2020. We're also going to be reviewing some specific next steps in the State Board of Education's review and adoption process. Before we get started, we want to get to know our audience. So what is everyone's current role here today? If you work for a publisher, what is your primary responsibility? Are you a content developer or a sales manager? Or you might be here from a district. If none of these options apply, you can definitely select other and explain more in the questions field in the GoToWebinar application. And we will close that poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let's go ahead and see our results. Okay, so it looks like we have some people from our district, some varying degrees of publisher responsibilities. We're going to be talking about all of those different responsibilities today. And we're also grateful to have our districts here observing our directions to publishing companies. So let's move forward with our agenda. Kelly Calloway, our Senior Director of Instructional Materials, will be discussing how publishers may participate in the proclamation. Jessica Snyder, Director of Special Projects in the Curriculum, Standards, and Student Support Division, will be discussing the essential knowledge and skills and the English language proficiency standards. Hugh Norwood with Trinity Education Group will be discussing machine-readable TEKS and providing additional details about this new requirement. Hugh serves as the CEO of Trinity Education Group, and we're very happy to have him with us today. Debbie Gonzalez, our Accessibility Coordinator in the Instructional Materials Division, will be reviewing the accessibility requirements within the proclamation. Amy Williams, our Director of Review and Adoption, will be talking about the specific deadlines and requirements within Proclamation 2020 and also provide some resources to help publishers navigate this process. Kelly will then offer some final thoughts and closing remarks. We will be monitoring questions we receive during the webinar through the GoToWebinar application. We will answer those as time permits. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted to the publisher portal along with all of our slides and a complete audience question and answer document. We have a few more questions for our audience today. So if you are a publisher, did you participate in either Proclamation 2010 or Proclamation 2011? These proclamations were issued by the State Board several years ago, and it was the last time the State Board of Education called for English materials. And we will close that poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let's go ahead and see our results. Okay, so kind of an even split here. A lot has changed since then, so we're definitely going to be talking about those changes today. Let's go ahead and move on with our next poll question. So have you participated since the establishment of the Technology and Instructional Materials Allotment by the Texas Legislature in 2011? And we will close that poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, great. So we have some returning publishers. That's really great. If you have not participated since then, don't worry. Kelly's going to be talking about the funding in her presentation. So let's move on to our next question. So which of the following recent proclamations have you submitted materials? Please select as many as you need to. And we will close that poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, great. It looks like we have a lot of recent publishers with us today. We are glad that you keep coming back and we haven't scared you away. So we are always looking to improve the process. So thank you so much for continuing to participate. I just want to remind you that you can submit questions through the GoToWebinar application. We will do our best to answer all of them as time permits. And we're posting a recording version of this webinar to the publisher portal, along with a full list of the questions and answers we provided. And we're going to go ahead and move things right along and pass it off to Kelly.
Thank you, Sarah. I believe I have successfully shown the right screen and unmuted myself. We appreciate your participation in those poll questions. It really helps us to know what the level of experience out there is for people who have participated in recent proclamations. If you've participated in more than one recent proclamation, you know that the process, not the rules, but the process changes a little bit every year. And in large part, that's due to feedback from you on how we can improve that process and make it more smooth. So if you haven't participated since, for example, Proclamation 2014, I think you'll notice some definite improvements to the efficiency of our process. So what I'm going to spend my time doing here is just talking about some things that you should know in general. For most of you, since most of you are experienced, this will not be of much interest, so feel free to check your email while I'm talking. For those of you who haven't been with us in a while or who are new, hopefully this will help you navigate the process a little bit. We're going to start off with some vocabulary lessons. It's part of English language arts, as it is part of every subject. And I want to mention some acronyms that we're going to use all over the place. And I just want to make sure that you know what we're talking about when we use those acronyms. And so I'm going to go through these one by one. There aren't too many, so hopefully it won't get too boring. First of all, we use AIM for Accessible Instructional Materials. Education Service Center is an ESC. For those of you new to working in Texas, we have 20 regional education service centers, and they are part of the review and adoption process. You'll see when we get to Amy's section about timelines that you are required to interact with those ESCs to a certain extent. One of the things that your products must meet are the ELPS, or the English Language Proficiency Standards, and hopefully you're familiar with those. EMAT is not an acronym or an initialism. It's just an interesting little name for the electronic ordering system that we use. And you will be interacting with EMAT both prior to and after the adoption. Prior to the adoption, to submit certain required forms to us, and after the adoption, if you have products adopted, to fill orders from districts. We refer to instructional materials as IM whenever we can, just to save some space in the things we're writing. When we get to the TEKS, Jessica will talk about the knowledge and skills statement. KSS isn't an initialism we really use all that often, but every now and then you might come across it. You will definitely interact with the NIMAC and use the NIMAS. NIMAC is the National Instructional Materials Access Center, and NIMAS files are files that meet the National Instructional Materials Accessibility Standard. Debbie will talk about that in the accessibility section of this presentation. Of course, the State Board of Education is responsible for adopting materials, and so it is on their behalf that we manage this process, and we refer to them, of course, as the SBOE. Jessica will also talk about SEs in her TEKS presentation. Those are student expectations, and those are the specific parts of the TEKS that your products must directly address. Amy will talk about your statement of intent to bid, or your SOITB, which is a set of letters I always have trouble saying out loud unless I'm looking at them directly. Eventually, if your product gets to this point, if you decide to continue with the process to this point, your products will be reviewed by an SRP, or a state review panel. The rules that we're following in putting this process together come from the Texas Administrative Code. or the TAC. And of course, they're all based on statutory requirements found in the Texas Education Code, or TEC. I've already used the term TEKS, Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills, and again, that's what Jessica will go over. And the WCAG is the Web Content Accessibility, or the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which Debbie will talk about when she gets to the accessibility section of this webinar. Let's talk just a little bit about funding. I don't believe we've already asked whether you were at the previous Proclamation 2020 webinar. If you were, you already know this information about funding, so continue checking your email. But we're going to keep it short this time in order not to bore those of you who were here. We had over $1 billion set aside for this biennium for instructional materials. Out of that money comes certain set-asides that are identified by the legislature, certain things that they specifically want us to fund from those funds. And this biennium, that was roughly $80 million. The result then, once we take what's left and divide it by the number of students in the state, was a per student allotment of $186.32 for this biennium, with an additional $19.19 for each bilingual student. Those funds can be used for a variety of purposes. The one that you're most interested in is in orange up there at the top, instructional materials. Instructional materials of any kind, adopted or non-adopted. And then they can also be used for technological equipment, training staff in the use of instructional materials or technological equipment, providing access to that equipment, the salary of individuals who help provide that access, and activities related to the local review and adoption. Because once you're adopted at the state level, then you will also want to be adopted at as many local levels in as many local districts as possible. And the local district has their own process for doing that. Specific issues, expenses that can't be managed with the IMA are listed there on the right. I won't go over them because that would really be boring. But we will post these slides, so if you want to look at those in more detail later, you'll be able to do that. So let's talk a little bit about the review and adoption process. The proclamation is issued after the TEKS are revised. So the proclamation is the SBOE's way of calling for new materials that cover those revised or brand new TEKS. Proclamation 2020, and this is something you probably already know since you're here, but calls for materials for all of these subjects. If you were with us at the previous Proclamation 2020 webinar, this may come, and you haven't been paying attention since, this may come as a bit of a surprise for you. Because initially, Proclamation was issued calling simply for high school English and English as a second language courses. So that's those courses you see there in orange. And that is what we told you Proclamation 2020 was calling for when we had the previous webinar. But since that time, the State Board has added all of the courses you see there in black or dark gray. These are what we used to refer to as English Language Arts electives. They're no longer considered electives because some of them can satisfy students' fourth English Language Arts requirement for graduation. Not all of them, but some of them. So these are just the other English Language Arts and Reading courses, and you can see there's quite a collection there. Additionally, although the board called for materials in the new courses, English Learners Language Arts for grades 7 and 8 in Proclamation 2019, we did not get any submissions. And so the board decided to go ahead and add those two courses to Proclamation 2020 to give publishers sort of a second chance at submitting materials for those two new courses. Proclamation 2020 also gives you the opportunity to submit new correlations for existing materials if you're going to continue to offer those materials. So for the first time in Proclamation 2019, the first time in any proclamation ever, this was an option, and it continues to be an option for 2020. If you've got currently adopted materials, you're able to continue offering those materials on the market. You can participate in this proclamation using those same materials, but just aligning them to the newly revised TEKS. You can also use those same materials and combine them with new materials, supplemental materials, so that the two products, I'm going to call them, together would bring you to the TEKS coverage requirement. And so those are new options that the board is offering to publishers in a hope that they might lead to some more cost-effective options for school districts. In general, products are adoptable if they cover at least 50% of the TEKS. They cover 100% of the required ELPS. When we get to ELPS, you'll see that not every English language proficiency standard is required for every grade level or every subject. Some of them are just less appropriate than others to be covered in especially student materials. They're adoptable if they're free from factual errors, including significant grammatical or punctuation errors. They're adoptable if they are deemed to be suitable for the subject area and grade level, and they've been reviewed by academic experts in the subject and grade level. So those two at the bottom are new requirements since the most recent legislative session. And now those have been written into rules, so you will find them in the Texas Administrative Code in Section 66.66B. Suitable for subject and grade level is a determination made purely by the state board based on their own review of the materials and also based on public comment regarding the materials. Being reviewed by academic experts happens when we bring the SRP or the state review panel together in the summer to review the materials for TEKS coverage. Other changes that have been made recently in the Texas Administrative Code that you are going to want to be aware of, especially if you participated in, say, Proclamation 2014 or 15, but not in Proclamation 2019. When you submit to us a sample, and that happens in, Amy's going to correct me on this when it's her turn if I get it wrong, but I believe that happens in April. That sample must be available on our website or through our website for the duration of the adoption process. You can add new material, you can add new versions of the sample, but that original sample must be available through the entire review and adoption process. Another change in the Texas Administrative Code recently is that the commissioner may remove materials from the list if you fail to meet deadlines established in the schedule of adoption procedures. Amy's going to be going over those deadlines. She's also got several steps in place to help you be constantly vigilant regarding those deadlines. So we'll do everything we can to help you not miss any of those deadlines. But should, after adoption, you fail to meet required deadlines, especially regarding the availability of the materials we need to create accessible materials, the materials we need to create Braille, for example, then you can be removed from the list. This last one we've been allowing for years, but it has now been written into code. The publisher of adopted materials may add post-contractual bids to your contract in response to identified needs of districts. Sometimes you identify the various packages in which you want to offer your products, and then you hear from districts saying, we really want this other combination instead. And if there's enough of a need for that, then you're able to submit a supplemental bid to add that new version to your contract and make it available to districts through EMAT, because that really is the most efficient way for districts to purchase materials. Not today, but before you get much further into this proclamation, I highly recommend that you read these sections of the Texas Administrative Code. We do our very, very best to educate you on everything that is in these sections, but the actual rule language itself is your very best resource for making sure that you really understand the rules and the requirements. And so these are the sections that are most pertinent to you and the ones that you're really going to want to read carefully. And as an old English teacher, I'm going to tell you, you should be annotating them as well while you're reading. Again, I want to encourage you to submit questions. We've already gotten one, and that's great. But we like to get lots of questions because the questions help us know what we need to expand on and what we need to explain better in the future. With that said, thank you very much for listening to me for these few minutes.
Thank you so much, Kelly. A lot of great information. Let's go ahead and check in with our audience with a poll question. So, have you already watched the TEKS and ELPS presentation from the Introduction to Proclamation 2020 webinar? This webinar was held in March earlier this year. We will close that poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Oh, so a lot of people have not watched our previous webinar. That's okay. Jessica is going to be talking about the TEKS and ELPS coming up next. But if you have, that's really, really great. And if, again, if you haven't, Jessica will be talking about it. But I would definitely encourage everyone to go back to the publisher portal and watch that previous webinar in March. So with that said, again, as Kelly said, we're going to try to answer our questions as time permits. So please get those questions in through the GoToWebinar application. The webinar is being recorded and, of course, will be posted to the publisher portal. Let's move to questions off Jessica.
Okay, hello everyone. Good afternoon. Again, I'm Jessica Snyder from the Curriculum Standards and Student Support Division. And I'm going to talk to you about the Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills, the TEKS or TEKS, our state curriculum standards, for some new and existing high school courses for English Language Arts and Reading and English as a Second Language. I'll also talk to you about the 2 new courses at middle school that will be included in the proclamation, as well as the English Language Proficiency Standards, or ELPS, and how all of these things relate to Proclamation 2020. So first, just a little bit of background information. The revised TEKS for English 1 through 4 and English speakers of other languages, which are also referred to as ESOL 1 and 2, were adopted in May of 2017. The TEKS for the other high school English courses that are a part of this proclamation were last revised in 2019. And in terms of the new courses for English 1 through 4, although they have been adopted, they're still waiting to be implemented in classrooms beginning with the 2020-21 school year. As I mentioned, those other high school courses have actually been in place for some time, but I think Kelly mentioned that they were not included in a previous proclamation, so they've also been included in the proclamation for 2020 to provide some additional resources and instructional materials for those courses. So I'd like to call your attention to the 2 links on the right-hand side of the screen. The English Language Arts and Reading TEKS are provided in Chapter 110 of the Texas Administrative Code, and I've included a link on the slide. The English as a Second Language TEKS, which include, again, those ESOL 1 and 2 courses, are actually in the Spanish Language Arts and Reading and ESL chapter, which is Chapter 128. And I've also provided that link here. You probably are accessing the TEKS through Breakouts or other resource and correlation documents that have been provided to you from the Instructional Materials Division. But I just wanted to make sure that you're familiar with where the TEKS are codified, where you can find them. And I've got a couple of examples just to give you an idea by screenshots what that would look like. So this is a screenshot of Chapter 110. I mentioned that these new TEKS that were adopted in 2017 will not be implemented until 2020. but they have been adopted, so they're in the Texas Administrative Code. That means that until we're in a time frame, that we're currently in a time frame during which the current TEKS that districts are using appear side by side in the Texas Administrative Code with the new TEKS. To identify the new TEKS for Proclamation 2020, look for the standards with adopted 2017 in the title. This is a screenshot of Chapter 128, which I mentioned is titled Spanish Language Arts and Reading and English as a Second Language. So similarly, they're side by side with the current TEKS that are being used in classrooms, but you can differentiate the new TEKS that will be a part of Proclamation 2022 by looking for adopted 2017 in the title. I'm going to pause here for just a moment to explain a little bit how English 1 and 2 and ESOL 1 and 2 are related. English learners may substitute ESOL 1 for English 1 and ESOL 2 for English 2. This is why these courses are actually virtually identical, since they satisfy the same graduation requirement and students would take the same state assessment. How they differ is that ESOL courses have additional student expectations that support language development and acquisition for English learners. So the review committees that work on these standards are given the guidance they can't delete anything that's included in English 1 and 2, but they can add those support expectations for English learners. And then this is just a screenshot going back to Chapter 110, where those existing courses that have been in place for some time are available. They're in the same chapter as English 1 through 4. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what has changed with the new standards that will be implemented in the upcoming school years. One of the most immediately apparent differences you'll notice if you're familiar with the current TEKS is that the standards have been reorganized around 7 strands. Strands are essentially topics or categories around which the standards are organized. So while structurally the new TEKS might look quite different, this change is primarily a reorganization, but of similar content. And this is a list of those 7 strands: developing and sustaining foundational language skills, comprehension, response skills, multiple genres, authors, purpose and craft, composition, and inquiry and research. So the strands themselves also include the 4 domains of language: listening, speaking, reading, and writing, and thinking. Some of the strands are made up of 2 or more substrands. So if a strand is a category, a substrand would be like a subcategory. Substrands vary by grade level. They have unique knowledge and skill statements and organize student expectations into related subcategories within a strand. So here's an example. This is an example of a strand. After the colon are the 4 domains: listening, speaking, reading, and writing, and then thinking, using multiple text. Here's an example of substrands. This strand is multiple genres. It's the same for each. But the first example has a substrand, literary elements. You'll notice it's followed by a couple of dashes or hyphens. For some reason in our rule text, we're not able to use an M dash, which would be preferable. But this is the format that you'll see in the TEKS, is those double dashes. And then this first substrand is literary elements. The second example is also the multiple genres strand, but the substrand is genres. The student expectations under the first example will focus on literary elements, and the student expectations under the second example will focus on genres. We'll talk more about knowledge and skill statements in a bit, but you'll notice that they are differentiated by and related to the topic in the substrand. Just as a reminder, not every strand is further divided into substrands, but this is a list of the 3 strands in which you will encounter substrands with their substrands listed below. So developing and sustaining foundational language skills has substrands of oral language, beginning reading and writing, vocabulary, fluency, and self-selected reading. I'll pause here and note that not all of the substrands are in all of the grade levels. Beginning reading and writing is not included in the English 1 through 4 standards for fairly obvious reasons. Moving on to the multiple genres strand, there are 2 substrands that we just looked at, literary elements and genres, and then the composition strand is further divided into the substrands of writing process and genres. Okay, other changes you'll notice significant revisions to the introduction. We're going to talk about the introduction a little bit later when we talk about the structure of the TEKS, but I want to just point out that for the new standards, some of the new topics addressed in the introduction are as follows. They address the interconnectedness of the 7 strands and their focus. The recursive nature of the standards is reinforced throughout the grade levels and courses. I do want to talk a little bit about this 3rd bullet, the relationship between text complexity and rigor across the grade levels. This is, in terms of text complexity, you'll notice that some of the student expectations, they're similar skills that students are expected to repeat that they've mastered in earlier grade levels, but they're expected to demonstrate those skills with increasingly complex texts as they move through the grade levels. There's also specific information to guide the instruction of English language learners or English learners, that's a little transition in terminology that we use now, ELs, in their acquisition of reading skills, their vocabulary development, and their improvement in English language proficiency, as well as the role of oral language proficiency for success in schools for all students. So one of the things that is also different in the new standards is you'll notice that there are the different genres are identified at grade levels. We refer in the new standards to literary texts, but that's referenced in the earlier grade levels as children's literature, but it also includes fiction, poetry, and drama across the grade levels. Informational text is one of the other genres that's addressed. And then there's persuasive and argumentative text. These are very similar standards for persuasive and argumentative text, as well as the characteristics of them, but the writing committees felt strongly that the terminology should be differentiated between grade levels K2 and the higher grade levels. And then finally, multimodal and digital texts. Multimodal, and I'm not the expert, but according to Google, and the teachers who had done a lot of research around this particular genre. This can refer to kind of multiple genres within one text, but I think it really is a little more expansive definition of that and can refer to different mediums and modes within a text. And that's why it's combined with the digital texts. And again, that genre is addressed across the grade levels. Looking specifically at the high school courses, in the multiple genres strand, there are specific types of literature addressed for English 1 through 4. And this is also a change for the TEKS because previously the type of literature was only specified in English 3 and 4. So in the example here, you'll see in English 1 and ESOL 1, the student is expected to read and respond across American, British, and world literature. For English 2 and ESOL 2, that focus is on world literature. And then at 3 and 4, it's actually consistent with the current TEKS. At English 3, the student is expected to read and analyze American literature across literary periods. And at English 4, the student is expected to read and analyze British literature across literary periods. And then the genres that students are expected to read are aligned with the genres that students are expected to write. So you'll also see these genres. I think I pointed out earlier, genres is one of the substrands in the composition strand. And so you'll see references to all of these texts in that strand as well. Okay, let's talk about some of the new reading and language arts courses that have been developed for English language learners. So for our English learners, Kelly referred to these are actually not high school courses. The grade 7 English language, I'm going to try again. English learners language arts. It doesn't roll off the tongue for me. ELA. We have an ELA course at grade 7 and grade 8. Similar to the alignment that we discussed with English 1 and 2 and ESOL 1 and 2, these two courses, the ELA courses, are almost identical to their counterparts, the grade 7 and grade 8 TEKS for English language arts and reading. The difference, similarly as well, is that additional student expectations have been added to support English learners' language development. So a student can essentially substitute an ELA course for the English language arts and reading course for their grade level at grade 7 or 8, because all of the standards for those courses are addressed. The ELDA course, which is the last bullet point, and I probably didn't talk about it when I was showing you a list of the English speakers of other language courses earlier, but this is a new high school course. It differs from the ELA courses in that it is a co-requisite. A student may only take the ELDA course concurrently with another English language arts and reading course. It's designed to provide additional support and credit to help students to master the content in that co-requisite English language arts and reading course. So another way we talk about co-requisite courses is that they are not a standalone course. A student could not just take English language development and acquisition as their English language arts and reading course 1 year. They would have to co-requisite, take that and pair it with another English language arts and reading course. And these are not new courses, but new to the proclamation, this is the list of other courses that Kelly looked over with you earlier. One thing I would mention about this list, though, is that, and I won't read it to you, but in addition to just an interesting note about these courses that is also something relatively new with the Foundation High School program is that students are not limited to taking English 4 to satisfy their 4th credit in English language arts and reading under the Foundation High School program. They can also satisfy that 4th credit with one of these courses. They can even combine half credits from 2 courses in this list, but they must complete a full credit. Okay, so that's a little bit about what's in this proclamation. Now I'm going to step back a little bit and give some more general information about the structure of the TEKS, which is really consistent for all of our subject areas. And I'm also going to talk about the ELPS. So I've been using most of this terminology throughout the presentation, so hopefully you have some familiarity with them already, but just in case, here's a list of some of the important TEKS terminology. First of all, the knowledge and skill statements, which are broad general statements. They are numbered, and I think of them as kind of an introductory statement or umbrella for the student expectations that are grouped underneath that knowledge and skill statement. Next are the student expectations, which, as Kelly mentioned earlier, and I've probably used a few times as I've been talking, they're also referred to as SEs. They're the actual expectation of what students should know and be able to do, and they're grouped under those knowledge and skill statements. Student expectations are differentiated by capital letters. And when we talk about the TEKS, we're usually most commonly talking at the student expectation level because that's the actual student objective as well as what's being covered and addressed in the instruction materials. But I'm going to talk a little bit more about why we shouldn't be too narrow in focus and just looking at student expectations in a bit. The next thing is Romanettes. There are Romanettes in the English language arts and reading and English as a second language TEKS. They're used sometimes in student expectations when you need an additional level of information. An example might be if there's a list that's included. And then we've talked about strands and substrands. Again, they're topics or categories used to organize the knowledge and skill statements and essays under those topics or within those topics. And we have not talked about breakouts yet, but they are the component parts of a student expectation, and we're going to talk about them in greater detail and look at some examples. All right, that's terminology. Let's talk about the structure of the TEKS. There are 4 major parts of our standards. The first are the general requirements, which they can talk about. They can address a little bit more than this, but they generally outline in high school the award of credit or any prerequisites. They are only in high school, though I should say we do have a couple of middle school courses with general requirements. The introduction appears at the beginning of the course for each grade level. And again, we really encourage, I talked earlier about the introduction being important and all the new information and the new standards, but we strongly encourage anyone working with the TEKS to carefully review actually the introduction. There's some important information and content and context about the TEKS and the standards there. And then finally, there are the knowledge and skills and student expectations. This is an example of a general requirement from ESOL 1. It includes the language, for example, about the substitution for English 1. And then next, this is an example of the introduction, which is a description of the content of the course. Again, it has key information about the course and the standards. And, just focusing on that key information for teachers that can really be referenced or that cannot easily be referenced or included in the structure of the student expectations themselves. I talked about the information earlier about text complexity. Here's another example that section from the introduction for these new standards that talks a little bit more about those 4 domains. They're not just, they repeat with every strand, so it's, I think, easy to kind of start to glance over them. But in the introduction, it really talks about their interconnectedness with literacy, as well as outlining the progressive nature of the strands across the grade level. So again, it's important information in the introduction that kind of drives and kind of previews and outcomes that we want students to have who receive instruction in these standards. So finally, the knowledge and skill statements. They are broad statements as what students should know and be able to do. You'll see that they actually start with the strand statement. This is the response skills, followed by the 4 domains: listening, speaking, reading, writing, and thinking using multiple text. And then there's just that broad statement about this section of the TEKS and the student expectations that will be introduced under this KS. I will read this knowledge and skill statement. I've highlighted it in blue for you. The student responds to an increasingly challenging variety of sources that are read, heard, or viewed. The student is expected to. This is another example. It's actually the same knowledge and skill statement, but for English speakers of other languages, ESOL 1. And again, the course is virtually identical to English 1. You may have noticed there's a different number, and that's because of that addition of some additional student expectations and maybe even knowledge and skill statements to support the English language learner. So this is number 7 in the standards for this course. But I've also underlined a statement in this knowledge and skill statement that is unique to the ESOL and ELDA courses. Based on the students, it's the underlined sentence I'm reading, based on the student's language proficiency level and with appropriately provided English language developed scaffolding, the student is expected to. So I included this just to reiterate that, like the introduction, there's important information in the knowledge and skill statement that should inform how a teacher would teach or an instructional material would address the student expectations that follow. So I hope you'll include them in your review of our standards. And then finally, this is just an example from the oral interpretation class, which is one of those existing courses. They also have strands, but because this course was adopted previously it does not follow the new strands in the English 1 through 4 or ESL courses. This is an analysis strand, and the knowledge and skill statement is the student analyzes the chosen text to assess its implications for adaptation, interpretation, and performance. And finally, we get to the student expectation. The SEs are really where the rubber meets the road. The student expectations are directly related to the knowledge and skill statement. They're more specific about how students demonstrate their knowledge. They follow the phrase, the student is expected to, and they always begin with a verb. And here I would just point out that verbs are really important for several reasons. First, they directly identify what students must do. But several student expectations in the English, Language Arts and Reading, and ESL TEKS are very similar across grade levels, but are differentiated by the verb. So the complexity of what students are doing may increase simply because the verb requires a higher level of knowledge or application. So it's not only important to review verbs, I would suggest, for each student expectation in a course, but across courses or grade levels if you're submitting for multiple products. So here's some additional important terminology in the TEKS. I guess "and" is not terminology, but some important wording in the TEKS. Starting with "and." When we encounter "and" in a student expectation, it means whatever's on it, either side of it, usually must be included. Similarly, "among," in anything that follows that word must be covered. There's some exceptions to that, I'm realizing, and I'll talk about it when I get down to "such as," which is I paused a bit. But let's move on to the word "or." One "or" really means one or the other, so it's not required to cover both or everything in a list that includes "or." An instructional material could certainly cover all of that content, but it isn't required to do so. Including is similar to "and" and "among" in that it is required to be included. And then "such as." "Such as," however, is a phrase used before an example, and anything after "such as" is not required to be taught or included in an instructional material. So where this sometimes gets a little tricky is if you had a list after "such as," and so you had "and" or because you had a list of multiple things, you have to kind of keep your bearings within the student expectation, because anything that follows a "such as" is just an illustrative example. So this wording will be important moving forward, so I'll be referencing it again. All right, this is an example of a student expectation, and it also uses the proper formatting that we use at the agency with "one," that's your knowledge and skill statement in parentheses, and a capital D in parentheses representing the student expectation. The student is expected to identify the characteristics of oral language and analyze standards for using informal, standard, and technical language appropriately. So you'll notice not only is the student we've got two verbs, that student is expected to identify characteristics of oral language, and they must analyze standards for using all of the things in the types of language in this list, both informal, standard, and technical language appropriately. Just while we're looking at the communication applications course, again, this is one of those courses that existing courses that's a part of the proclamation. But just by the way, this is the course that's also known as speech. As you probably know, a speech course is no longer required for graduation on the Foundation High School program, does not require completing a course, but students must demonstrate proficiency in certain speech skills and as a part of their graduation requirements. So many districts continue to offer or even require the communications applications course as a means for students to meet that requirement. Here's another example of a student expectation. This is from ESOL 1. The student is expected to determine the meaning of foreign words or phrases used frequently in English, such as bona fide, caveat, carte blanche, tête-à-tête, bon appetit, and quid pro quo. And apologies to any language, any folks speakers of other languages if I did a terrible job with my pronunciation. But this is a such as. The reason I included this slide or this student expectation on this slide is to point out that that list of foreign words are simply examples. An instructional material or teacher could cover all of them or potentially none of them. However, that base part of the student expectation does require that the meaning of foreign words or phrases used frequently in English must be covered. Okay, so now we're moving on to breakouts. Breakouts identify the component parts of each student expectation. And what I should say here is that these are not a part of the TEKS themselves or of the TEKS, but they are developed and provided by TEA and used to determine the coverage of an SE. So you can access the breakouts, and I'm not the best person to help you navigate instructional materials, but I know they're linked into your publisher portal and provided by the instructional materials division to help kind of break out some of these standards so that you can see all of the component parts that your instructional materials would be required to address. This is an example of a breakout. And this is from English 1, adopted in 2017, so the new standards. The first column has the knowledge and skills statement. The student uses metacognitive skills to both develop and deepen increasingly complex texts the student is expected to. The next column is the student expectation, which leads with a verb, make connections to personal experiences, ideas in other texts, and society. And then the breakout column. So this student expectation is the base is making connections, but it requires that students make connections to multiple components, and that's what the breakout outlines. Make connections to personal experiences is the first breakout. Make connections to ideas in other texts is the second breakout, and make connections to society is the third. This is an example from the ELDA course, and I'll skip to the student expectation column in the middle. Use print or digital resources such as glossaries, English dictionaries, bilingual dictionaries, thesauri, and available technology to determine meanings and usage. So back to our wording for the TEKS. Or is either or. So for a breakout, we keep them together so that you can see both options. But you'll also notice there's a such as. This such as is a little strategically placed. It's in the middle of the student expectation because it's the list of resources, glossaries, English dictionaries, bilingual dictionaries, thesauri, and so on. But notice at the end there's a phrase, to determine meanings and usage. And this is something that that the curriculum division works very closely with the instructional materials division when we're doing breakouts, and we determined that that ending phrase is an important part of the standard. It shouldn't be rolled into the such as, and so you'll notice in the breakout to the side we have use print or digital resources so that you can see both of those options to determine meanings. The second breakout is use print or digital resources to determine usage. Okay, we'll come back to breakouts briefly at the end when we talk about coverage in the TEKS, but let's move on and talk about the ELPS. The ELPS outline English language proficiency levels in the 4 different domains of listening, speaking, reading, and writing, and the type of instruction that teachers should provide to students at those levels. They are required to be included in every course or grade level, and that includes the English Language Arts and ESL courses. However, only the student expectations in the ELPS that have been designated as appropriate for inclusion in the materials need to be addressed. But 100% of those ELPS that have identified that are appropriate to be covered must be covered. So give me just a moment. I'm going to pull over an example of the breakouts for the ELPS, just to show you what I'm talking about. This is from the Breakouts webpage that is linked to the publisher portal. And you'll notice the ELPS are structured very similarly with knowledge and skill statements and student expectations, but there are sections that have been grayed out, and those sections do not need to be included or addressed in your instruction materials. And that's not because they're not important, it's just they've been reviewed by staff and determined that either they would be difficult or just are not appropriate for inclusion in that particular way. This one, for example, the top one that's grayed out is about monitoring language production. So that's what we mean about those that have been designated as appropriate versus those that have been designated as not appropriate for inclusion in instructional materials. But just to reinforce, if they're not grayed out, they are appropriate for inclusion and must be covered 100% at 100% coverage for approval. You'll notice that there are fewer standards in total than student expectations for most grade levels and courses, fewer standards in the ELPS themselves. One other note I want to make about the ELPS is that they are scheduled to begin review sometime next year, but that will not impact the 2020 requirements. This is an example of a breakout. We just looked at one, but let's kind of break it out together. You have the knowledge and skill statement to the left. In the center, you have a student expectation. Spell familiar English words with increasing accuracy and employ English spelling patterns and rules with increasing accuracy as more English is acquired. So again, kind of following, I'm always looking for ands the word and when I'm breaking out. You start with the phrase, spell familiar English words with increasing accuracy and employ English spelling patterns and rules with increasing accuracy as more English is acquired. So you'll look in the breakouts to the right. Number 2 starts with employing English spelling patterns with increasing accuracy as more English is acquired. And then the third breakout is that same expectation, but employing English spelling rules with increasing accuracy as more English is acquired. So that's just a look at how breakouts look, what they look like, and they work just the same way as the TEKS do. Okay, so I mentioned we'll talk a little bit more about breakouts and connecting them with determining TEKS coverage. So all student expectations within a given knowledge and skill statement do not need to be sufficiently addressed in order for an individual student expectation within that group to count towards the 50%. We'll come back to that. However, all of the breakouts within a given student expectation must be sufficiently addressed in order for an individual student expectation to be counted towards the 50%. And I have kind of a visual that we'll walk through to make sure that that's really clear for people. But again, keep in mind what these 2 bullet points are. Is the first is that all of the student expectations under knowledge and skill don't have to be addressed in order to meet that 50%. But when you're looking at an individual student expectation, every breakout must be covered for that individual SC to be counted. So an SC is considered to be addressed if all breakouts for the student expectation are addressed at least once in, and I apologize, I have a little typo there, once in the student text narrative. So that's the narrative. The student text narrative is what provides the opportunity for the teacher to teach and the student to learn the content. So the student expectation must also be addressed once in an end of section review exercise, an end of chapter activity, or a unit test. That's the activity. It provides the opportunity for the student to demonstrate the skill or knowledge. So please be sure to note the requirement for coverage in both the narrative and the activity. These 2 things are required for the breakout to be considered addressed. And this is something that the instructional materials division staff are going to work very closely with you when they talk about the correlation documents, but we just want to introduce it to you today and let you know that you'll be learning more and receiving more training on this in the future. Okay, so I said I had kind of a visual of how the coverage is determined and how that connects with the breakouts. So let's look at this particular student expectation. It's from the ELDA course. This is the student in the knowledge and skill statement. The student applies knowledge and relationships found in the structures, origins, and contextual meaning of words. The student expectation reads, use print or digital resources such as, and we've actually reviewed this one, a list of those resources to determine meanings and usage. So we've looked at the student expectation before and the breakouts. So in a review of the of a particular instruction material, a panelist might determine, yes, this instruction material does provide opportunities for a student to use print or digital resources to determine meanings, and there are activities that provide that opportunity. This material also has opportunities to use print or digital resources to determine usage. So both of these breakouts are addressed in the instructional material. And that means that the student expectation is covered. Here's another example. This student expectation is from English 1. It says, make connections to personal experiences, ideas, and other texts, and society. Again, we looked at this before. It's the one about making connections. So in reviewing an instructional material, a panelist might determine, yes, in the breakouts, this instructional material does have opportunities to make connections to personal experiences, both in the narrative and activities. Not able to find one of those examples for connections to ideas and other texts. It's missing. But I did find opportunities for students to make connections to society. Because only 2 of the 3 breakouts for this student expectation were identified as covered, this student expectation does not count towards the 50%. It has not been covered. So in terms of determining coverage, just to reiterate, each student expectation is reviewed independently. I mentioned that there are typically more than one student expectation associated with a knowledge and skill statement, such as an A, B, C, D, E. If all of the components of part 1 are addressed, all of the breakouts are addressed in an instructional material, it's considered covered. If all of the breakouts for the component parts of student expectation B are addressed, it's considered covered or addressed, and the same for C and D. But if one of the breakouts for student expectation E are not covered, like in the example we just looked at or that's on your screen, then E is not addressed and doesn't count towards the 50%. But that determination about E does not impact the determination that was already made for A, B, C, or D. They were identified as covered and are counting towards the 50%. So again, just to reinforce, each student expectation is considered independently, but all of the breakouts for a student expectation must be addressed for the individual student expectation to count towards the 50% that's required for the proclamation. And finally, student expectations for the ELPS are considered to be addressed if all breakouts of the student expectation are addressed at least once. There's not the same distinction regarding how the content or where the content for the ELPS is covered. And that is the completion of my segment of this presentation. I appreciate your time. I feel awkward not being able to pause and ask you direction for questions as I go along, but I think they'll give the instructional materials division staff will give you an opportunity to do that.
Thank you so much, Jessica. A lot of great information. We are going to go ahead and pause for a moment and check in with our audience, make sure everyone's doing okay out there. So before we move forward with our next presenter, are you familiar with the term machine readable TEKS? Okay, and we will close that poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let's go ahead and look at our results. Okay, so majority is not familiar with the term. That's okay, because Hugh, who is the CEO of Trinity Education Group, is going to be talking all about this term. So we're going to quickly pass it on to him.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to talk a little bit about the TEKS and machine-readable TEKS in particular, which is a new requirement for digital materials for Proclamation 2020. Let me give you a little bit of background about what the machine-readable TEKS are. And after this, we could redo that poll, and 100% of you will say, yes, I am familiar with the machine-readable TEKS. Machine-readable TEKS is fundamentally, it's a digital version of the TEKS. You saw earlier the location of the TEKS on the main TEA webpage, referring to the canonical reference of the TEKS in the code, administrative code, and the machine-readable TEKS are identical. And it's important to note that that they're identical, and they're not. It's not a different thing or a separate thing. It's the same material. It's the same content. It's just enabled to be read by machines and applications that are digital and educational technology oriented. And the background to this, the reason for developing these machine-readable TEKS is really it grew out of a need that the TEA heard from, and the SBOE heard from school districts around the state that were really starting to wrestle with this growth in digital materials and digital applications, many of which were beginning to get connected to learning standards, and were attempting to provide references to the TEKS. And as a function of that, really the districts were running into some challenges with, and you can see some of those already, recognizing the versioning that was being used, recognizing the fidelity with which those materials were aligning, and understanding what codes or designation or format those TEKS were in for that particular application or digital content, relative to the state's required coding and designation and structuring of the TEKS. And you just got a great walkthrough of how the TEKS are structured, what's included, and how detailed they can be at that breakout level. And so for districts which need to obviously manage their teaching and learning outcomes to those thresholds and those requirements, it becomes very important that they have a reference to TEKS that they can rely on, that they have high fidelity with, and that will maintain version and state with the TEA's required documents. So that's really the purpose behind the machine-readable TEKS. And to demystify it, really, the machine-readable TEKS is just a way for us to code and structure and technically standardize the TEKS themselves in such a way that computers and applications can read them and refer to them, and that those referrals or those alignments or those connections can be maintained through a RESTful API or through kind of the coded database structure that's already there. And I'm going to briefly walk you through what we'll do to demonstrate that or show that to you. There is an access point on the TEA's Texas Gateway, and you'll be able to use that site to gain information, gather, have questions answered, and be directed to different ways to use the machine-readable TEKS and download them. So if you are a digital publisher or you're intending to provide digital materials as part of Proclamation 2020, it is required that you align your materials to the machine-readable TEKS. To do so, you can simply download a CSV file, which is a comma-separated values file, tab delimited file, an Excel format, basically, or you can use the machine-readable TEKS directly through an API, RESTful API that we have available for you. It's free, and we maintain it as part of the Texas Gateway application. and we'll continue to provide guidance and technical support both to the instructional materials team at the TEA as well as to publishers looking to conform to the requirements. What I'll show you next is just the basic front page or two here of that site that I referenced earlier. Here, this is the welcome page. You'll be able to register here as a publisher, which will give you the access to the machine-readable TEKS for download and use. And from here, once you've logged in, you'll be able to read up on the documentation. You'll be able to identify which form of the TEKS, of the machine-readable TEKS you prefer to use, whether that's the API or downloadable CSVs. And you'll be able to keep up to date on versions and updates. One important requirement here for machine-readable TEKS is that we have designed this at the TEA's direction to conform to the IMS Global required standard of interoperability called CASE, which is really the interoperability standard IMS is providing for curriculum frameworks and standards of learning. And that's what allows different publishers, different applications, learning applications, to use machine-readable learning standards and student expectations and keep those references technically up to date, both from a versioning perspective and also maintain them with high fidelity to the canonical reference, which in this case is the TEA itself. So that's really a very brief, but it's a simple new addition to the requirements for your alignment project that should you pursue Proclamation 2020 for digital materials, and it will help districts. It should help you as you engage with those districts in terms of providing high fidelity and high quality alignments between the content and the materials you provide and the standards the TEA requires. And if you need assistance throughout this process, there's a website there which again you can go to for help, as well as an email assistance kind of help desk or help support center for that. Thank you very much. Up next is accessibility requirements.
Thank you so much, Hugh. Before we move forward with our next presenter, we are going to check in with our audience one more time. So if you are a publisher with adopted digital products, have you ever conducted an accessibility audit for your materials? And this is a new requirement that came about as part of Proclamation 2017. And we will close that poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, great. So it looks like we have a lot of returning publishers. That is great. It's okay if you have not participated in that. Debbie is going to be talking about that. And before we move on to Debbie, I just want to remind everybody that the webinar is being recorded, and we will be posting all of our slides and the recording and a complete audience question and answer document to the publisher portal as soon as we can. So let's go ahead and move on to our accessibility coordinator, Debbie Gonzalez.
Welcome this afternoon. I'm going to talk about accessibility, and probably the most important thing to keep in mind is that all instructional materials must be accessible to students with disabilities. People with disabilities frequently experience barriers to the use of printed materials, digital materials, and technologies. Okay. So examples where barriers might occur include textbooks, digital documents, websites, apps, learning delivery systems, electronic devices. Ideally, these are designed from the start for a wide range of users with diverse abilities and disabilities. Unfortunately, this is not always the case. So accessibility really is making instructional materials usable by as many people as possible. That will treat everybody the same and give everyone the same opportunities. So if they're designed or enhanced in a way that makes them usable across the widest range of learner variability, regardless of format. There are actually two types of accessible materials, and the first one I'm going to talk about is print materials. What's required for print materials is that TEA contracts with third parties to convert adopted print materials to Braille, large print, audio, and digital text for those students with print disabilities who need one or more of the formats. And publishers of print materials are going to be required to provide the NIMAS files of their programs to facilitate the production of the specialized formats. The files are technical standards used to produce those files, which the accessible student-ready alternate format versions, such as Braille, large print, audio, can be created and then distributed to the students. The U.S. Congress actually adopted the NIMAS requirement as part of IDEA in 2004. What to know about the NIMAS files? Basically, they're XML-based source files created by publishers or other content producers to be used to create those accessible specialized formats. The full set of the NIMAS files include the XML content files, but also a package file, images, and a PDF of the title page or whatever contains the ISBN and the copyright information. NIMAS files will help facilitate the timely access to alternate formats. They help those vendors create the Braille or the large print in a timely manner so those students can receive the instructional materials as soon as possible. You may have to provide two versions of the NIMAS files. You'll be required to provide NIMAS files with your pre-adopted materials, but then also if you have any corrected materials, you'll also have to provide a final file. And there may be fees associated with the creation of the NIMAS files. The NIMAC probably is one of the best sources to find out about the NIMAS files. They will help you set up an account, they help you set up the metadata, and you can visit their publishers' pages for the NIMAC. This will give you some places you can go. The National Association of Accessible Educational Materials, which we call the AIM Center, they have a special place on their website that talks about the NIMAS files, and then, of course, the NIMAC. And again, the AIM Center has a best practices website and how to create those NIMAS files. The second type of instructional materials that need to be accessible are electronic materials, and we're finding more and more publishers create these. In the same way that it's not right to exclude someone from a physical building because they're in a wheelchair, it's also not right to exclude someone from a website because they have a visual impairment or they have a physical disability that prevents them from using a mouse, something like that. Accessibility is part of the law, but it's also the right thing to do. Publishers that have electronic instructional materials adopted by the State Board of Education must contract with a reputable third party to provide a report for each electronic component. That report must verify that the components follow WCAG 2.0 AA, standards and also the technical standards required by Section 508. And those, WCAG has been kind of put into Section 508, so they're not two different things now. You can find additional information about the requirement on pages 11 and 12 in A1 and A2 of the proclamation. One of the hardest things I think that it has taken some people to understand is that just because something's digital doesn't mean that it's accessible. So, and what we're trying to encourage publishers to do is to actually make something born digital or born accessible. That accessibility is for users with disabilities to effectively use the websites, the mobile or web-based applications, the software, the hardware. And the systems really need to be designed so that they can interact appropriately with assistive technologies. Some examples of assistive technologies. Some of these you've probably heard about, some of them maybe not so much. Screen readers, braille keypads, screen magnification for somebody that is low vision or is blind. Voice recognition software so that people that can only use their voice can actually navigate through the websites, or head pointer switch devices, even just the keyboard, a regular keyboard, so that if someone has limited movement and they can't use a mouse, they'll be able to navigate through those websites. There's a new imperative for publishers to create the content in a born accessible way. And so when you start to think about your digital content, consider ways to make that content accessible to everyone. Again, the AIM Center, aem.cas.org, has they have tremendous resources, and they have a best practices part of their website that's specifically for publishers and software developers. And I know that they would be more than willing to have you contact them if you have any questions. There's also the Center on Technology and Disability has a 2-page little flyer that they have created called the Born Accessible, a quick guide. That's probably pretty, it kind of explains it in a quick, easy way to understand. And then there are some places that you can find free webinars. I'm always looking for free. So one is from the Great Lakes and Pacific ADA Centers. They actually have something called Accessibility 101, an ingredient in the recipe, not an addition for afterwards. It's much easier to make it born accessible as to try and retrofit that. Also, there's a company called Level Access, and they provide webinars for free quite frequently. I've also found that you can Google accessibility or accessibility webinars, and you come up with a lot of information and a lot of good places to go. Finally, if you need to contact us, this is my contact information, and then Leanne Lee is our accessibility specialist here, and she'll be more than happy to to help as well. So please call us if you have any questions, and we'll see if we can't help out. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Debbie. A lot of great information. Again, I just want to kind of let the audience know that we know that we throw a lot of information at you today, and so don't be worried if you missed something. We are definitely going to be posting a recording along with all of our slides to the publisher portal very, very soon. So, but let's go ahead and check in again, do a quick poll. So do you currently subscribe to the Review and Adoption listserv? And we will close that poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let's go ahead and see our results. Okay, so we have a little bit more yeses than nos. I was really hoping for 100% yes, but that's okay, because if you don't currently subscribe, we definitely encourage you to do that. A lot of value information is sent through that listserv, but we are glad, of course, that a lot of people are getting that information. So we will now hear from Amy Williams, our Director of Review and Adoption. She'll be discussing the proclamation and the many resources that are available. So we'll go ahead and pass things off to Amy.
Hi there. I know that you can't see my screen yet, but I promise that'll be coming soon. Sorry, it happens to me every time. At any rate, as Sarah mentioned, I'm going to outline a few of the deadlines that you'll be required to meet, and I'm going to focus primarily on those deadlines that happen between now and the state review panel meetings. But I'm also going to show you where to find the full list of deadlines and show you some resources that we've created to help you understand each of those deliverables. The first thing that you'll need to do is provide contact information on a company information form. And we'll need the information about several different folks at your organization. First is the instructional materials review contact, and that's the main point of contact for TEA in the months leading up to the review. This is the person that's going to receive all of the email reminders and phone calls anytime we have a question about the deliverables. The bids and contracts contact is the person who should receive the electronic version of the contract when it's ready to be signed by your company. The accessible materials contact information will be provided to our accessibility coordinator, Debbie, which you just heard from. And this person is the one who should be able to answer questions about NIMAS files and the accessibility audit that Debbie talked about. And I got ahead of myself. The district sales and customer service contacts will be added to our website on a list of publishers who are participating in Proclamation 2020. And these are the people that someone would contact if they're interested in obtaining more information or maybe requesting a sample. You'll need to submit the company information form before you will be allowed to submit your statement of intent to bid. And you're going to submit this form online using our EMAT system, but for those of you who are new, don't worry, you don't have to have access to EMAT or an EMAT login in order to do that. We will have an access point on the publisher portal that will allow you to get into EMAT and submit this deliverable. You must submit the statement of intent to bid to tell us that you want to participate in the proclamation. So this is a really important deliverable. You need to submit one even if you're just considering participation and you haven't decided 100% that you want to participate. On the statement of intent to bid, you'll only be required to provide very basic program level information, including the program title, a list of media formats that you intend to offer the product in, a very preliminary estimation of the TEKS that you estimate your materials will cover, and any hardware or system requirements needed in order to review any of the items that you will include on your submission. You must submit your statement of intent to bid no later than 5 p.m. on Friday, December 7th. And as I mentioned, if you don't submit a statement of intent to bid by this deadline, you're not going to be permitted to submit any materials for consideration. So I hope all of you are grabbing a pen or typing into your calendar or your phone to mark December 7th as the deadline for statements of intent to bid. After you submit the statement of intent to bid, you'll have a month to complete or to submit your complete description. Every complete description is linked to a statement of intent to bid. You will provide details about each of the components in your program that you intend to use in your correlations and as a review to demonstrate TEKS and ELPS coverage. That gives us a little more information about what you intend to submit and what we need to review at the state review panel meeting. So that helps us prepare for that meeting. You may have additional components that you want to add to your official bids later in the process, but this is an important distinction to make. You have to limit the components on your complete description to just those that you need to achieve your desired TEKS coverage percentage. So I hope all of you sales folks out there listening are hearing me say this, because it often makes the sales team nervous to see complete descriptions that don't have everything on it. So just those that you need to achieve your TEKS coverage percentage. All of those additional components that you want to sell to districts can be added to your official bids, which you submit after the review. The complete descriptions are due no later than 5 o'clock on Friday, January 25th. A few months after you submit your complete description, you'll be required to submit a copy of your materials for public review. These are called pre-adoption samples. And the pre-adoption sample must be a digital copy, even if the final product will be print. That makes for an easier public review. You can't include any sales or marketing materials or links in the pre-adoption sample. So this means you cannot give reviewers the option to view items available for purchase or provide access to the sales contact anywhere on your pre-adoption sample pages. The term sample can be confusing, especially if you're new to this process. The materials you submit for public review need to be complete versions of the final product and contain all of the components you intend to offer, not just those that you've put on your complete description. You'll send the sample by email to TEA and also to each of the 20 education service centers by 5 p.m. on Friday, April 5th. Once you've submitted your pre-adoption sample, you must track every single change you make to the content, including error corrections, editorial changes, and new content. So for that reason, we strongly suggest that your materials undergo a thorough editorial review prior to submitting your pre-adoption sample, because that'll reduce the number of changes that you'll be required to track throughout the process. We will post the pre-adoption samples on our website to make it easier for members of the public to access those materials and to provide feedback. If you're uncomfortable having your assessments or answer keys posted publicly, you are permitted to provide us, TEA, with 2 versions of your pre-adoption sample. One version for us to post to the website, and another version for TEA staff that is unrestricted and does contain those assessments and answer keys. As a government agency, we are required to ensure that every document we post to our website is accessible. So if you decide to submit your sample as a PDF, you must make sure that that PDF has undergone a thorough accessibility check and that any accessibility issues have been remedied. And if you have any questions about that, feel free to contact us and we can walk you through that process. Your correlations are absolutely the single most important deliverable you'll provide. You will use a correlation document provided by TEA to record the exact location of the content you're using to address each of the student expectations. And you can only use the components you included on your complete description when completing your correlations. You'll be required to email your correlations to TEA and each of the 20 ESCs at the same time that you send your pre-adoption samples on April 5th. You must dedicate adequate time and resources to complete your correlation. They can take weeks to complete. If you start working on your correlations early enough, you might identify ways in which you need to modify the content in your program to better address the TEKS and ELPS. It's best to be able to identify and make those changes before you submit the pre-adoption sample and correlations. And the correlations are important for several reasons. They not only help you refine your TEKS coverage percentage, they also hugely predict the outcome of your review. Accurate and thorough correlations, along with an easy-to-navigate product, will more likely result in a positive review. When reviewers are unable to locate the content you reference in your correlations, or when publishers provide a citation for a large range of pages, for example, page 10 through 25, the reviewers can get frustrated, and it is absolutely in your best interest to make the review as easy as possible for the reviewers by providing correlations that point to specific, easy to locate content. If you have a digital program, you're also required to embed your correlations in the program. And this is going to be new for those of you who have either not participated since 2010 and 2011 or who are new to the process. So when I say that you're going to embed your correlation, that means that you have to have links to your correlations that live inside your program that will take users directly to the specific location that you've listed on the correlation document. So once you've built these links within your program, you'll also add the links to your correlation document. The affidavit of authorship is also due on April 5th and will need to include every person who is listed as an author or contributor of the instructional materials, and you'll describe the extent to which each of those individuals contributed. This form will be made available on the publisher portal, and you'll submit it via email. Current TEA employees are prohibited from authoring or contributing to the development of materials that you present for consideration. In June or July, we'll convene panels of experts to review instructional materials using the correlations you've provided to determine the extent to which those materials meet the TEKS and the ELPS. We really encourage publishers to attend at least the first day and to set up your materials and equipment possibly the day before. But on that first day, you'll be invited to observe the orientation for the reviewers and to attend a brief publisher meeting. We will provide you with details as soon as we have them about when those meetings will take place. For those of you who participated in Proclamation 2019, look up at your screen because you might recognize this picture. We actually took this photo at the state review panel meetings this past July. So you're getting a peek at what real state review panel meetings look like. Each of you will be assigned to a publisher liaison after submitting your statement of intent to bid. The liaison is going to be your main point of contact throughout this whole process. And if you already have materials adopted in 2014 or later, you have already been assigned a liaison. And I just want to let you know that we'll do our best to keep you with the same person, but we may have to do a little bit of shuffling to balance workload. Now, I'm going to assign you some homework. I know Kelly has already pointed out some of these things, but it's very important that you take the time to read the statute and the rules that govern the review and adoption process. So you should spend some time reading Chapter 31 of the Texas Education Code and Chapter 66 of the Texas Administrative Code, specifically those sections that Kelly pointed out earlier. You also need to read the proclamation and the supporting documents, which are the questions and answers document and the publisher handbook. But I will mention that although the proclamation and questions and answers have already been posted, we're still making final revisions to the publisher handbook and hope to have that posted next week. Your next bit of homework is to decide who's going to be responsible for managing all of these deadlines and submitting the deliverables. It's really important that before you get too much further in the process, you've identified this individual so that you don't miss anything. You need to carefully review the breakout documents and decide which components are going to be required to meet the desired percentage of TEKS and ELPS, so you know what you're going to put on your complete description. If you don't already have ISBNs for your program and each of its components, you need to get those as well. And finally, you need to be prepared to submit your statement of intent to bid, which remember is due by 5 p.m. on Friday, December 7th. There are some specific steps you can take right now to improve your chances of successfully getting materials adopted through Proclamation 2020. The first is to pay very close attention to due dates. We've created a checklist which we'll place at the back of the publisher handbook that includes the official due dates for the deliverables and also some suggested timelines for activities related to those deliverables. Give yourself plenty of time to complete the tasks associated with each deliverable, especially if this is your first time participating or if it's been several years since you've done so. This is definitely not something that you want to try to rush and do at the last minute. Please take the time to conduct a thorough editorial review of your materials before you submit your pre-adoption sample. I know I mentioned this already, but I just really want to emphasize it. The pre-adoption samples will be made available for public review, and it's best that when people lay eyes on that content, the content is as error-free as possible. And also, as Debbie mentioned, digital products should be designed with accessibility in mind rather than trying to retrofit something at the last minute. And finally, never, ever, ever hesitate to ask us questions. There is no question too small or too big or too silly to ask. We are definitely here to help you. So now we're going to ask you one more question, one more audience participation, and that is whether or not you've ever visited the publisher portal. Just going to give you a few more seconds to get your answers in. All right, we'll close this poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let's see what the results were. Okay, so it looks like about 2/3 of you have visited the publisher portal, which is great. I'm going to speak to the 30% of you who have not and show you what you can find on the publisher portal. So you'll see that we're at the main Texas Education Agency page. And from this page, you'll see these tiles up here at the top. And if you were to hover over academics, I'm going to first take you to the instructional materials page, but you don't actually have to go that way. So at the instructional materials page, you'll see this latest news section. That's always a good place to check to see what's happened recently. But here on the right-hand side, you'll see Publisher Portal. And when you click that, you will have arrived. And so on the Publisher Portal, we try to put everything that you might need in order to succeed as you move through a proclamation. And the information is organized by proclamation. And we always have the most recent one at the top. So you can see here we've got the Proclamation 2020. We've got a link to the machine-readable TEKS that Hugh spoke about, a copy of the proclamation. We have the questions and answers, a link to the breakout document. And then we have our previously recorded webinar from March. And for those of you who said you hadn't watched it, I know you've already committed to a good 2 hours with us today, but we still would strongly suggest that you go back and watch the original webinar so that you're starting with all the information that you need. And this is exactly where we'll post the today's webinar. It'll show up right next to this one. But while we're here, I want to go ahead and click on the breakout document so you can see what you'll be looking for on that page. So these are organized by the chapter in which the content appears in the Texas Administrative Code. So Chapter 74 is the English Language Proficiency Standards. And so if you were to click on English, it'll download a PDF and pull up the ELPS. And I saw some questions about the grayed out ELPS. So I'm just going to scroll to the second page so you can get a glimpse at what that looks like. So you'll see that 1B is not required. We did go ahead and do the breakouts for 1B, but it says NA here. And the ones that are required will be white and have required grade levels. This required grade level column, you'll see T, K through 12, and S, 6 through 12. And for this proclamation, it's not as big of a deal because what this means is that you're required to demonstrate coverage of the ELPS in teacher materials, that's what the T stands for grades K through 12, and in student materials for grades 6 through 12. In the case of Proclamation 2020, we only have those 2 middle school courses and all of those high school courses. So you're required to demonstrate coverage of the ELPS in the student material and the teacher material for any ELPS that are not grayed out. And then you'll see Chapter 110 is where you'll find the English Language Arts and Reading breakout. And I'll just click on one quickly so that you can take a peek. You'll see that they look similar to the ELPS breakout document. These are the breakouts that you'll need to be aligning your content to. And then you'll have to scroll down to the bottom to get to those ESOL courses. There's the English 1 for speakers of other languages and English 2. And I'm noticing, oh, there we are. There's English Learners, Language Arts 7 and 8. So you'll find those in Chapter 128. I'm going to go back to my slides here. All right, so that was just a quick tour of the publisher portal. So that's one resource for you. We also we'll have created a CSV file with important dates, and you may be asking, like, what on earth will I use this for? And we've done this actually at the suggestion of one of the Proclamation 2019 publishers, and we will create this file and email it out to you when you submit a statement of intent to bid, and you'll be able to download that file into your calendar, so it'll preload all of those deliverable deadlines that I've been talking about right into your calendar. So if it turns out that you want one sooner, you are welcome to reach out to us at review.adoption@tea.texas.gov, and we'd be happy to send it to you. Otherwise, you can expect it after the statement of intent to bid is submitted. And Kelly's going to come back and possibly answer any questions if they've come in and give us some closing remarks.
Thank you, Amy. Yeah, usually at this time I have lots of questions that we were not able to keep up with in the question list, but this time I really only have one, and I'm going to ask Amy to answer it. Could you respond to Lisa's question about the template for correlations, please?
Of course. So the template for correlations isn't something that we post to the website, and the reason why is that only those of you who submit a statement of intent to bid will be allowed to correlate your products using that template to turn in on April 5th. So what you would do for the time being is look at the breakout documents and try to determine the extent to which your materials align to those breakouts. Once we get the statements of intent to bid in December, we will have those correlation documents ready, and we'll send them to you that month so that you can get started on your correlations.
Great, thank you. And I believe we've covered all of the other questions, so I hope that those of you who submitted questions, and by the way, thank you very much for doing so, but I hope you feel like your questions have been appropriately addressed. If not, you can always reach us at reviewandadoption.tea.texas.gov, and we will be happy to take all those questions that you thought of after the webinar ended. We have used almost all of our time. We really appreciate your coming, and we really appreciate your sticking with us for the almost full 2 hours. Have a great weekend.